Happy Pesach, bitches. Dude, I always forget to count the Omer. Sometimes. I mean, like, I always get it, but, like, what if you count the Omer now? I think it's funny. Really? It's close. Brugada Danai Malcolm, Shirka Shana Bidman Stop with Savannah, Al Sifra HaOmer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is one day of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash in its place. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place speedily in our days. Amen. For the choir master, a song with instrumental music, a psalm. May God be gracious to us and bless us. May he make his countenance shine upon us forever, that your way be known on earth, your salvation among all nations. The nations will extol you, O God. All the nations will extol you. The nations will rejoice and sing for you. The nations will rejoice and sing for joy. For you will judge the peoples justly and guide the nations on earth forever. The peoples will extol you, O God. All the peoples will extol you. For the earth will have yielded its produce, and God, our God, will bless us. God will bless us and all from the farthest corners of the earth, and all from the farthest corners of the earth shall fear him. We implore you, by the great power of your right hand, release the captive, accept the prayer of your people, strengthen us, purify us, awesome one. Mighty one, we beseech you, guard as the apple of the eye who seek your oneness, bless them, cleanse them, bestow upon them forever your merciful righteousness, powerful Holy One, in your abounding goodness, guide your congregation only, and exalted one, turn to your people who are mindful of your holiness, accept our supplication and hear our cry. You who knows secret thoughts, blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. Master of the universe, you have commanded us through Moshe, your servant, to count Separat HaOmer in order to purify us from our evil and uncleanliness. As you have written in your Torah, you shall count for yourselves from the day following the day of rest, from the day on which you bring the Omer as a wave offering. The counting shall be 7 full weeks, until the day following the 7th week shall you count 50 days, so that the souls of your people Israel may be cleansed from their defilement. Therefore, may it be your will, Hashem, our God and God of our fathers, that in the merit of the Separat HaOmer, which I counted today, the blemish that I have caused in the Sephirah, Chesed, Sheva Chesed, be recited, that I may be purified and sanctified with supernal holiness. May abundant bounty thereby be bestowed upon all the world. It rectify our nefesh, Ruach and Shema from every baseness and defect, and may it purify and sanctify us with your supernal holiness. Amen. So that's tight, baby. Really? A little early, but who fucking knows? Alright, are you done? No, they need to make some changes in that. The L word should have a hyphen. The G word that should have a hyphen. Or just a hashtag. It's easier. Alright, are you done though? Dog, my eyes hurt. They're like pouring out liquid. Going blind, unfortunately. (3761) Creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. Chava 3631 130 Seth, son of Adam, was born. No one really knows for sure. Elu Ve, Elu Divrei, Elohim Chaim, but this is the Mazor we live by. That's tight. Really? Now everything sucks, dog. 97 days of this bitch.
Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience.
Coffee,
here
Kabbalah,
on
Kabbalah, coffee.
Esoterica. If you want, you can
This
find
is
the entire
athleticism.
series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. I hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Well, I want to say welcome back. Welcome back this evening to the second part of our 10-session walk through Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. And we talked about last time, right? And Kabbalah, right? We're still 1,200 years away from Kabbalah. It's still way off in the distance. So we're still very much in the time period right around the turn of the Common Era. That's to say, around the year 0, right? That's if you want to get an anchor of where we are. And just to recap a bit, right? Just to recap a little bit from last time to sort of see where we are in the lay of the land. We defined mysticism, at least for the purposes of this class, which doing things like defining mysticism makes it certain that everybody will disagree with you that studies this stuff. So I'm just basically, anytime I say, I'm going to define mysticism, it's like putting a target on my back. But the way that I want to define it is as a non-rational mode in which one experiences or learns about fundamental reality, and also the traditions that accrue around those experiences. So I would call someone, for instance, that studies mysticism for the idea that those mystics learned fundamental truths, even though perhaps that person themselves didn't have those experiences. I would also consider that person a mystic. So I would say that there's also the idea that you lean on the mystics to learn what they learn, and that puts you in the tradition of folks who are, in fact, mystics. And there's an entire tradition in Judaism of what we'll call intellectual mystics. Those much later. And intellectual mystics are those that say, look, I never had this experience, but I trust that this person did, and I think that they're fundamentally right. So that's also, I think, another form of mysticism that actually doesn't involve mystical experiences. And as I mentioned last time, the first Jewish mystics weren't even Jewish. The first Jewish mystics were Israelites, which is a much broader category. Remember that the Jews received that name, the Yehudim received that name as being the descendants of one of the tribes that comprise the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Jewish mystics actually make up a minority minority of this. So many of the prophets we have in the Hebrew Bible are from all over. They're not necessarily Judahites. And we said that the two forms of mysticism that seem to have been prevalent in Israelite society at that time were folks who experienced theophany, that is to say, God showed up to them, God appeared to them, and on the other hand, for other people, God spoke to them. And if you speak on the behalf of God, that makes you a nabi, a prophet. Although sometimes those folks are referred to as ro'eh, as seers. But the idea there is that we have the idea that either those folks can see the future or they hear something from God and they communicate that to other people. And those folks we typically refer to as the prophets. And the most important theophanies in the Hebrew Bible, historically speaking at least, we don't think that the theophany described in Exodus, where God showed up to the Israelites and to Moses, we're fairly confident that that's a mythological piece of information, not a historical one. But we are relatively confident, many scholars are relatively confident, that the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel did have some kind of phenomenological encounter. In that encounter, they recorded in the literature of the book of Isaiah and the book of Ezekiel, respectively. Now, the idea that, now you might be wondering, right, how can you say that Moses didn't exist? Well, it's not about whether he did or didn't, it's about what we have evidence for. And we just don't have evidence, really, to believe that that happened. But we have pretty good evidence to believe that the experiences of Isaiah and Ezekiel were, in fact, recorded. And as we talked about last time, prophecy is very well attested all over the ancient Near East, with the weird exception of Egypt. Egypt is kind of prophet-free, which, all things being equal, sounds great. I wouldn't want to live anywhere. I don't want any prophets in my neighborhood. I don't want any guy walking down my street screaming at people because they're like, woe to the disbelievers, Yahweh's going to kill you all. I'm like, I'm going to call the cops on you again. So I don't want to live anywhere near prophets. And so Egypt seems like a pretty great place to be prophet-free. But at any rate, we saw last time that there are a great deal all through the ancient Near East, and especially in the Neo-Assyrian context, which tracks very carefully, very temporally to the ancient Israelite context. And so we actually know a good deal about those other ancient Near East prophets. We also know that one of the things that happened in the ancient Near Eastern world were prophetic duels. They just didn't take prophets' words for granted because they kind of seem crazy. And if they seem crazy to you, they seem kind of crazy to people back then too, right? Just because you see Jesus in your toast doesn't mean Jesus is in your toast. It might be that you might need help. And so many people in the ancient world also thought, right, this guy's just drunk, right? And there's many cases in the Bible where people do prophecy and other people are like, yeah, they're drunk. And so this was an idea. And so we see other ancient Near East cultures engaging in prophecy and mechanisms by which to detect whether a prophecy is reliable or duels between prophets to establish which prophets are actually telling the truth. Prophetic duels need to be a video game. Just saying. It's a fighting game with prophecy. And what brings prophecy to an end and what sets us up for a transition to tonight is that, as you may remember, part of what happens in the theophany literature of the Hebrew Bible is that the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, makes themselves known by revealing a bunch of very inconvenient rules. And by revealing all these very inconvenient rules, the idea is that the Israelites are bound to follow those rules, and Yahweh will protect them and give them land and provide for them to have large families and agricultural surplus. Well, what ends up happening is that for various reasons, the Israelite state is destroyed and the Judean state is destroyed. And as you might imagine, when your entire theology is founded on a vassal contract, right, and your vassal, the person who justifies your vassal relationship, gets defeated, well, that's the end of that. And so, again, it's like you're living in a house and your landlord gets bought out by, I don't know, some sketchy investment firm. Well, you got a new landlord. You have no longer a relationship with the old landlord. Well, now you got to deal with other gods. And so the Israelites have some pretty complicated problems in their hands. And the pretty complicated problem on their hand is we predicated an entire theology on one system and it didn't work. Our God seems like either God is defeated or we're defeated, and what now? Right? What do you do now with the awkward relationship with your former landlord? And so what's going to happen is that prophecy, the idea that there are people speaking on behalf of Yahweh, what's going to happen is that's going to increasingly go away, right? And a new form of religiosity is going to emerge. And that new form of religiosity that's going to emerge is going to be a new kind of mysticism. And that new kind of mysticism is what scholars typically refer to as apocalyptic. All right, Tanakh pop quiz. But you know this is coming. So Tanakh pop quiz, and this is a trick question because, of course, it is. You're in a class about mysticism. Does anyone here know, and feel free to put it in the chat, where in the Tanakh are the events surrounding the Hanukkah story recorded? So I think I should say they're not. That's the answer that's the less wrong answer. You're certainly right, they're not recorded straightforward. Anyone know where the events of the Hanukkah story are actually depicted in the Tanakh? Not in the Apocrypha, like in the book of Maccabees, where they're literally described, but in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, as you may know it. Everyone's like, why are you asking damn questions like this? I'm the one taking this class, right? So actually, you are right. It is not described transparently in Tanakh. It is, however, described encodedly in the book of Daniel. It is actually encoded in the book of Daniel. Now, the book of Daniel is probably the least read Jewish book in the Hebrew Bible. It's in some ways one of the most confusing. But historical scholars of the Hebrew Bible, scholars of the book of Daniel, are fairly confident that encoded in a very elaborate system of symbols, the story of the conquest of Syria, Judea by Alexander the Great, civil wars between his generals that led to the various empires of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, also with the rise of the Romans and the period of the Maccabean Rebellion, are in fact described using coded language in the book of Daniel in chapters 7 through 12. If you've never read the book of Daniel, it's a very weird book. And by the way, it's one of the few books in the Hebrew Bible that actually has extensive sections actually written in Aramaic. In chapters 7 through 12, there is a section that is encoded using a very elaborate system of symbols that describe all the things I just put out. Now, what's very interesting about this section of the book of Daniel is that the writer, whoever's writing it, is describing the very beginning of the Maccabean Rebellion, right? But they never describe the end of it. Now, that leaves an open question. Why don't they describe the eventual success of the Maccabeans? And they're very pro-Maccabean, at least. They kind of tempered on the Maccabean, actually, which a lot of people were because they were terrifying anyone that wasn't a religious zealot. Everybody in this class would be killed by the Maccabees, just FYI. Everybody. They would gladly kill all of us for being like, not them. Which is always weird about Hanukkah. Hanukkah's a complicated idea if you're a progressive, liberal-minded Jewish person. They're like, yeah, I'm celebrating the very people that would have literally to the Taliban, not the Taliban of Judaism. At any rate, we don't know why they don't finish. We don't know. They may have just died. You know, if it was a war, and the Maccabees didn't like people who could, I don't know, read. And so they may have just got killed. It may have just gotten killed. And so we don't see the end of it. But what's interesting about it is we now have a really good idea about when the book was written, at least those sections. They were written sometime after the Maccabean revolt began, but before it ended. So we know it began around 160 and it concluded around 167 BCE. So we have a good idea about where that section of Daniel, when it was written down. Now, why would people encode things in strange language? Why would people encode things in weird symbols? Well, because there's a new kind of literature emerging, a new kind of religiosity emerging in the
bye, Bondi.
Of the
Hot little piece of
the
shit.
prophetic period, and that new kind of religiosity is what we call apocalypticism. Also, by the way, describing current events as if they're taking place far in the future is what we call in the literature ex eventu prophecy. The vast majority of historical prophets did not predict the future. We'll talk more about the ones that tried and failed in a minute. But the vast majority of prophets who describe all kinds of weird things, and I'm sure folks have read some sections from the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation, written by St. John, or Nostradamus. So folks have read any Nostradamus. It's always weird stuff like an eagle. An eagle comes from the east and attacks the great bear, and the bear follows the sun, and the sun turns to blood, and you're like, what in the hell are you talking about? They're not describing the future. They're actually describing the present using encoded language, right? This is what we call ex eventu prophecy. They're describing things that have happened using codes. Why would they do that? Well, because it might be politically expedient to be a little cryptic, right? Because again, what is one of the things these people like to do? Criticize the standard order of things. And do you really want to be the person living in the Roman Empire being like, the Romans suck and I hate them and God's going to kill them all soon? You want to publish that? You don't want to publish that because they'll crucify you for it. So what do you write? Well, the Kittim, right, will arise from the sea and then blah, 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 right? You encode it. And the encoding mechanism is part of the apocalyptic version. So what isn't apocalyptic? That's the first thing we need to do. I know, right, that when most people hear the word apocalypticism, they're thinking end of the world. They're thinking all the crazy stuff happens in the end of the world. The Messiah's going to come, and there's going to be this and that, the Battle of Gog and Magog, and there's going to be all this stuff that happens at the end of the world, the Battle of Megiddo, whatever. And so many people typically imagine that what apocalypticism is about the future, because the word apocalypticism has been filtered so heavily through Christianity, and Christianity does tend to think of the apocalypse as like something happening in the future, although early Christians thought it was going to happen pretty soon in their lifetime. Jesus kind of dragging his feet. But they really thought it was going to happen soon. And this idea that it's going to happen in the future is an idea really from Christianity that has sort of shadowed and flavored the way that we use this word. Most apocalyptic writers, most prophets for that matter, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish tradition, don't do much in the way of trying to predict the future. They just don't. In fact, the most famous case where anyone tried to predict the future in the Hebrew Bible is in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26, where Ezekiel made what at the time was the single most predictable prediction that one could predict. That is, Nebuchadnezzar would destroy Tyre. Well, he predicted that because Nebuchadnezzar was destroying everything. Everything, right? It's just like predicting, right? It's like American imperialism will continue. Yep, it's going on, right? It's a completely normal thing to predict. And then they attacked Tyre, and it didn't work. Nebuchadnezzar was repulsed, and so Ezekiel himself actually has to come back later. He actually comes back in the same book and says, "Well, what I meant was," he has to reinterpret his own prophecy to explain the fact that he was wrong, even though it was completely actually predictable thing. So making predictions, especially clear predictions, is a bad idea, right? Folks may know the very famous quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, right? It never hurts a prophet to be, right? If you predict on Tuesday, March 2nd, 2029, that blah, 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 well, your prophetic career rests on that. And so most of the prophecies, they don't predict the future by and large, right? And in general, by the way, that whole Nebuchadnezzar thing for people who are biblical literates is a real pain in their books because they have to go back and explain why the Bible, why a prophet got it wrong, and then why a prophet admits he got it wrong, and then how he put a spin on it to fix it, and then they further spin it to further fix it. And my favorite example is, yeah, it eventually got conquered by Alexander the Great 400 years later. Somebody conquered it, so Ezekiel wasn't totally wrong. I'm like, really? That's the best you got? Okay. Most Jewish apocalyptic texts just don't have much interest in the end of the world. In fact, when they do describe the end of the world, they almost always lean on Hellenistic ideas. And those Hellenistic ideas, specifically the Stoic idea, was that basically God was going to trash everything at the end. That there was going to be some kind of global conflagration, that the world would be ended, would be destroyed by a giant fire. That was a very common idea in the ancient world. And so, in many ways, the predictions they do give about the end of the world are themselves just the popular ones. If you were to go to a Greek philosopher at the time and ask, what's going to happen at the end of the world? They say, the Logos, the fire, is going to consume the whole world. They're like, sounds reasonable. They went with that. So it's actually basically, it's not even really in some sense a Jewish idea as it is a Hellenistic idea, Greek idea. So let's put some context on this, right? I'm gonna say what the apocalyptic is in just a minute, but I want to put some context on this. What you have to understand about the rise of the apocalyptic is a time period in which it emerged, the political and theological upheavals that lasted from roughly about 586 BCE, when Judea was destroyed, the last independent Jewish state was destroyed, all the way up to around 135 of the Common Era, where the last attempt at an independence movement on the behalf of the indigenous people of Judea, Jews, against the Romans, led by Bar Kokhba, was defeated, with hundreds of thousands of Jewish people being killed in the process. What's important to understand about this political and theological landscape is that there is a major breakdown, as I mentioned earlier, in the theology of the time. As I mentioned earlier, right, this entire theology is built on what is called the Deuteronomic theology, which is again the idea that Yahweh and Israel have a covenant, and that covenant works in a way that the Israelites perform religious duties and Yahweh gives them stuff, right? So that is the way it's supposed to work. The prophets, the way that they understood themselves was as sort of a voice for God telling the Israelites, you're doing wrong, you're breaking the contract, and if you persist in this, God's going to punish you. God's going to break the contract. Well, after everything comes completely apart, beginning in the 8th century BCE, but by the 6th century BCE, the entire Judahite state is completely destroyed. There's just a serious problem. And the serious problem is, if the prophets were right, and if every single Judahite was massacred, well, that would have brought the prophecy to conclusion, right? You broke the treaty, and everyone's dead. Done. Right? And that would have been a very neat, when I say neat, I mean not untidy, except for all the gore of everyone being massacred, but it would have been a very tidy story theologically. Well, what happened? The Babylonians didn't kill everybody. They took the entire Judean aristocratic section into exile in Judea. And they kept on keeping on. Not in the land, right? Not in their own land, but in Babylon. And not only that, they had a good time. We have extensive records of the Jewish population living in ancient Babylon. And we know they were living relatively well. They owned slaves. They had land. They had businesses, right? In fact, their life was so good in Babylon, in exile, that when the Jewish people were allowed to return to Israel, to Judea, by the Persians, many didn't want to go. They're like, why do I want to return to like a rock that has no inhabitable land? I can live here by these rivers, and we can like live in good. This is a great empire. They didn't want to go home, and so once you go home, right? Because they weren't born there. They were diaspora Jews living in Babylon in comfort and security. Why go back to a wasteland to rebuild something, right? That isn't that great after all. It's like a rock in the middle of the Judean desert. And this was a big problem. In fact, there had to be Jewish people actually pressuring them to go back. So again, when we talk about the Babylonian exile and weeping by the rivers of the Euphrates or whatever, a lot of those Jews were not weeping by those rivers. They were very happy to be in exile in Babylon. And we know that because we have records of them living there. The problem, again, is a theological problem. They're still there. They still believe in Yahweh. What do you do when the prophecy meant that you're supposed to be destroyed and you weren't destroyed? So, does God make a new deal with us? Should we still believe in Yahweh? Like, the temple's been destroyed. What's going on with, what do we do with this Yahweh thing? The covenant doesn't make sense anymore. The covenantal theology doesn't make sense because there's a remainder that contradicts it. So, what do you do? What do you do? Well, there's a couple different options. You could try to maintain the old covenantal theology, and some people did try to do that. But you can see the logical problem of trying to maintain it. The covenant's been broken, the Judahite state's been destroyed, and its aristocracy moved to Babylon. They're still alive. What to do with that? That's a real problem. tried as a way of settling problems, right? Avoid problem by shifting your theology, right? Never let a good catastrophe go to waste. You simply innovate your theology. And what ends up emerging is a new kind of Judahite theology. In fact, I might even argue that Israelite religion went into exile, but Judaism came back. The religion that the ancient Israelites practiced would be unrecognizable to anyone here. Like killing animals and burning beer and grain to appease a sky god. No one here recognizes a religion like that. But what comes out of exile is a theologically innovated, renovated religion that is much more like the Judaism that we might recognize now. So what happens is that they innovate. They theologically innovate. They develop a new theology that maintains the trappings of the old covenantal theology, but radically philosophically changes what it all means. And so, what are those kinds of changes? The first big change is that Yahweh can't just be the God of Israel anymore. To make this work, Yahweh has to be a God of everything. Not just God of Israel and what the other gods being existing out there in the world, like this is what we call henotheism, right? Your God exists, my God exists, but my God can be of your God. That's what the Israelites basically believed. Now, the new shift is, not only can my God be your God's not real. There's just one God. Monotheism emerges in the aftermath of this catastrophe. So the God of the Israelites is now said to be the only God, and that God is responsible for everything. And not just responsible for everything, but responsible for everything forever. God has a plan for the entire cosmos. Right? This is going to be decisively important. God is planning everything. And everything that happens is according to that plan, no matter how bad it is, no matter how confusing it is. In fact, the worse it is evidence for the fact that God is preparing something amazing. Right? So this kind of theology is going to be decisively important in this matter. So what also has to happen here, right, is that the Israelites, right, are going to have to begin to change the way they think about their relationship to this God. And the problem is, this God's going to have to tell them what in the world all this means. We're supposed to have this covenant, and it's supposed to do like this, and this is supposed to happen if we keep it, and this is supposed to happen if we don't. Well, we didn't, and we're still here. What's happening? Well, what ends up happening, what ends up emerging, is that new kinds of prophets emerge in which God shows them the plan. Right? And again, hear the language here, right? The older prophets heard God and communicated what God said. The new kind of prophecy sees what God's showing them, right, and communicates what God shows them in literature. So this is a much more literary movement, and it's a much more visual movement. And it's so distinct that we now think of it as a distinct kind of religiosity. It's not prophecy. They're not speaking on behalf of God. They're describing what God has shown them, what God has revealed to them. And that is a completely different phenomenological mode of experiencing mysticism. Right? A very different kind of mysticism indeed. Now, what precipitates this? How do they get the ability to, what underwrites this? And the answer is really complicated, and the short answer is, we don't know. We don't know. Because we don't have good records about how this goes down. The best theory I've seen is that what ends up happening is that the Judahites go into exile and they come in contact with an up-and-coming important religion called Zoroastrianism. Now you have to understand that when the Judahite aristocracy goes into exile, the Judahite aristocracy is still a relatively, what's the right word to describe this here? The ancient Babylonians are like the New Yorkers of the ancient world. They're cosmopolitan, they're literate, they have an ancient culture that's been there for 1,000 years. They are wealthy. They have multiple giant temples, each of which is larger than the Israelite temple. It was a metropolis on an order of magnitude that the ancient Judahites could not have imagined. Ancient Jerusalem was a backwater. It was a tiny settlement of 2,000 people, right, with that little temple there that was, not much bigger than a basketball arena, right? You're talking about an aristocracy that is a relatively backwater people coming into contact with an incredibly old, incredibly literate, right? When the Judahites wanted to write diplomatic documents, they wrote it in the language of the Babylonians, Akkadian. When they arrived in Babylon, they must have been bowled over by the bumpkinhood of their existence compared to the Babylonians. Again, this is like the Mississippi aristocracy being conquered and then dragged off to New York, right? You can't imagine the shell shock of what must have happened. Furthermore, they're coming in contact with a very dynamic new religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is, of course, a reform religion founded by the prophet Zoroaster, who we don't know much about. Even when he lived is not clear. But if I summarize Zoroastrianism to you, I bet it will sound immediately obvious what they believe. So, Zoroastrianism is a basically dualistic religion that claims that a good god and an evil god are locked into a kind of battle for the destiny of the world. The forces of good are represented by non-physical spiritual entities, and those non-physical spiritual entities are in combat with other non-physical spiritual entities that serve the bad guys. Angels and demons, right? That structure's there. Now, this good versus evil dualism is going to result in a titanic, catastrophic battle at the end of time. The forces of good will win. They will throw the forces of evil into a netherworld, right? And not only that, there are even Zoroastrian prophets who are given tours of the underworld. Those tours of the underworld filtered their way up to Europe, and we're fairly confident that Dante Alighieri was influenced by them. The Divine Comedy is probably being influenced by these tours of hell of the Zoroastrian literature. Now, near the end of the world, there's going to be a savior figure, Saoshan, who will lead the forces of good against the forces of evil, and at the end of time, everyone will be resurrected bodily, they will be judged, right? And there is a massive set of literature, right, being composed by Zoroaster, and the idea is that your relationship to scripture is more important in many ways than doing sacrifice, like sacrificing animals. Those priests, by the way, are called Magi. You may recognize them from the Bible, right? Those are the guys that show up to adore the baby Jesus. At any rate, that should all sound pretty familiar to most of us. If you take a little Judaism and add a little Zoroastrianism to it, shake it up in your cocktail shaker, pour in a glass, you have all the ingredients for a great cocktail called Christianity, or Islam, or apocalyptic Judaism. Now again, many people detest the idea that Judaism could be influenced, informed, changed by non-Jewish pagan people. I got news for you. When the Jewish people arrived in this area, they would have viewed the Zoroastrians as a completely intellectually superior group of people. And I can guarantee you they would have been influenced by them. So Zoroastrianism probably has a huge impact. And in fact, many ways, Zoroastrianism has a huge impact in world religions in general. It also has a huge impact in music. You may know Freddie Mercury, the lead singer of Queen. He was a Zoroastrian. So thank God for Zoroastrians. They produced at least Freddie Mercury. So sadly, it's a threatened religion now. It's a very tiny religion, primarily located in Iran, America, and in Iraq, or in India rather. But they're not doing that great, unfortunately. They're pretty small. So we've now talked a little bit about the groundwork for apocalypticism. What is it, right? We call it a religious mode. When I use the word mode there, for folks who have some background in philosophy, right, a mode of being, it's a way of doing religion. It's not a religion itself, but it's an articulation within a religion. It began to exist primarily in Judaism, but obviously will persist into Christianity. In fact, Christianity is just, in many ways, apocalyptic Judaism perfected. It's when, in fact, apocalypticism becomes the religion, right? It's when the shift completely goes over to one side, and the apocalyptic is what really matters, and Judaism becomes an adjunct riding on the tails of the apocalypticism. One can imagine Christianity that way, but also in Islam. Islam is also largely an apocalyptic religion. Again, it's a religion based on a guy being shown things by an angel. It's fundamentally an apocalyptic religion. So what makes the apocalyptic? Now, what's important to know about this is that no one sat down in Judea or in Babylon and said, I'm going to invent apocalypticism. What they did was be religious, and they innovated. And the specific religious innovations that they developed, we now call apocalypticism. Right? So it's very important to note here, this is a scholarly term applied to an ancient people. And it's always important to know that when you do that, when you apply a schema to ancient people, it never fits perfectly. Right? Some things are left out, some things are left in, but it's such a stable kind of scheme that we do think that this is an important and decisive break with the prophetic religion of ancient Israel. So what makes apocalypticism? The first thing is what I mentioned here at the last, but I'll mention it first, because the last will be first. is the name apocalypticism, right? It comes from the word apocalypsis in Greek, which means to reveal or to uncover. And what's important about this literature is that what tends to group it all together is the idea that God is revealing something fundamental to the person, to the apocalyptic prophet. God's not speaking to the apocalyptic prophet, telling them, go condemn, some king, there's like king, right? Go condemn those people for being bad and being rich. That's the way a prophet like Amos worked. God spoke, and Amos went and said, right, woe to you people, cows of Bashan. No, here we have God revealing various kinds of things to a human agent. And typically, that's being mediated by a divine, semi-divine being, typically an angel. So an angel shows up and says, let me show you something. And what do they show them? All kinds of things. What kinds of things? Typically things like cosmology. Apocalyptic Judaism is very interested in how the universe works. If you've ever read the Hebrew Bible, one of the things that is weirdly missing from the Hebrew Bible is any discussion of how the world is arranged, right? There's some vague discussions in the book of Genesis, but there's no real sense of like, what is the world exactly? Because they're not really interested in what is the world exactly, right? They're interested in what's going on in Judea with this king. So cosmology becomes very, very important in the apocalyptic mode of Judaism. Also, they're very interested in the past. This is sometimes ironic, considering that most people think of apocalypticism as primarily dealing with the future, but mostly the apocalypticists are interested in the past. So they're very interested in how did we get here? And the thing that they're very interested in is where did evil come from, right? Because if evil is in the world and it's out there, what kind of existence does it have? And they're very interested in where it came from. You'll never see much in the Hebrew Bible about them discussing the origins of evil, right? Even the whole talking snake in the Garden of Eden, the writer of that story in the book of Genesis never says, and that's where all evil comes from. It names some things, right? You have to work for your bread, and women's child pain and the pain in having a child will increase. By the way, it says that the pain will increase. It never says there wasn't. It just went worse, right? So it never says, and that's why everything went off the rails, right? The apocalyptists will be very interested in this. Also, they're very interested in the use of symbolism, right? The Bible doesn't do much in the way of symbolism often, right? But the apocalyptists will be very interested in symbolism. They're in fact virtually encoding their writings. And also, again, as I mentioned earlier with the exit into prophecy, they're going to be really interested in engaging in the same kind of social criticism that we saw in the historical Israelite prophets, but they're going to be doing it in a way that in a literary form in which they encode those criticisms by describing them as if they're happening in the future, right? So they describe present events in an encoded way as if they're happening in the future. That's going to be a tip-off for an apocalyptic writer. Amos didn't encode anything. He called people cows for being rich. He's like, you people are bad because you're rich and God hates you. Like, he's not encoding anything. Like, he's not like, and the cows will eat and become fat on the land. No, he's like, I hate you people and God hates you too, right? That's not what these apocalyptic folks do. Also, what they're really interested in is oppression, right? They're very interested in oppression and tribulation. Specifically, why do bad things keep happening to us? If our God is the only God, and we have a special relationship with this God, why did the Greeks just like whip our ass? Like, that's a bad thing. Like, we just got whipped by the Romans. They just killed like a bunch of us. Like, what's going on, God? Right? That's a real important question to ask, right? I mean, we all ask the sort of like, why do bad things happen to good people question? It's like, why did we all get wiped out? Or most of us. They're very interested in why this tribulation's happening, right? And again, I say tribulation. The idea is it's real bad for a while, but for the apocalypticists, God has a plan. And not only that, the apocalypticists claim to know the plan, right? They claim to know the plan. They're also at some level interested in the end of the world, right? Now, and I say end of the world, what they're really interested in is the righteous and the wicked being separated, and the righteous being rewarded, and the wicked being damned. There's no hint of that in Israelite religion. Everybody in Israelite religion went to the same underworld, Sheol, It doesn't matter if you're a good person or a bad person. You went to the same place and it sucked. Well, the apocalyptists say that's not fair. Bad people will get punished. This idea comes directly probably from Zoroastrianism, right? So bad people get punished and the good people will get rewarded. That's the extent, really, of how things are going to go down in the future. And of course, right? Why does that make sense? Well, it makes sense because a lot of good people, or at least people they thought they were good, were suffering enormously under foreign occupation. They're also interested in otherworldly journeys, right? They'll go on journeys of the various realms of heaven, or they'll go on journeys to the various parts of the afterlife. It's very dualistic. That is to say, the world in apocalyptic literature is very starkly divided between the good guys and the bad guys, right? And the good guys are going to win, the bad guys are going to lose. You don't see that in Israelite religion. In Israelite religion, the prophets are, you're doing bad, but if you do good, God will not punish you. In apocalypticism is, you are bad, and God is going to destroy you. It's a much more dualistic worldview. Which again, if you study history, in times of intense political crisis, right, dualism emerges. The good guys and the bad guys, right? Whether it's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? Or whether it's the sons of light versus the sons of darkness, polarize the world, and that's often how you describe. And again, I think Marx is a kind of apocalypse in many ways. He would hate that idea, but he can happily roll in his grave. Paying back to that anti-Semitism on the Jewish question. So anyway, right? Also, what's really important about apocalypticism is someone's going to fix all this, right? Because clearly, if you look at the time period being conquered by the Greeks, being conquered by the Romans, being massacred by various people, it's pretty clear that we're not going to be the ones to fix this. And so what do they say? There's going to be some kind of savior figure who's going to enter into history and fix all this. And that, of course, as it ferments a little while, becomes the fine wine of messianism. That some person, or persons, by the way, early messianism never agreed about how many it would be. Many people thought it would be two messiahs. And one of those would die, right? And another one would become a military general and win. So ancient Judaism was never clear about there being just one Messiah. Many sections of Judaism actually believe there would be at least two. So, right? Now the Christians fix that by like having him die and come back later. They're just waiting on that last one. So they kind of roll into one dude, which is pretty smart. Also, there's all kind of anti-Messiah characters, right? You have a good guy fighting for the good guys. You're going to have a bad guy fighting for the bad guys. That's the Antichrist. And there are lots of different stories about the bad guys, right? Christianity really likes the bad guys too. And they make for good movies. The structure of heaven and hell is going to be a big part of the apocalyptic world. If they're going to describe to you where you're going to go when you die or when you get resurrected, they want you to know about it. And if there's really vivid depictions of the hellish worlds in the afterlife, it's pretty motivating. Like, I don't want to go there where they like boil you in excrement forever. That sounds bad. I don't want to go there. I'm going to be a good guy, right? So they're very interested in the structures of the various heavens and the hells, and they're also interested in the idea that behind the scenes of what's apparent to us, the world is actually being dominated by a vast majority of spiritual creatures. Typically, we now know them as angels and demons. And so, again, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, they're basically very little in terms of angels and demons. They kind of show up from time to time, right? But in the apocalyptic, they are everywhere. Angels and demons are literally all around you, engaging in titanic spiritual warfare for the destiny of the world. Right? And every country has its own angels, right? Michael's the angel of this country, Gabriel's the angel of this country, and every country has their own demon, etc. So the scale of things is also bigger. In Israelite literature, they kind of don't like the Egyptians, and they kind of don't like the Assyrians. But you never have a global analysis of the world, because they're kind of a parochial people. The apocalyptic writers are not parochial. They imagine the entire world divided into countries, and they explain political science in terms of this spiritual battles that are going on behind the scenes that we don't see. Their literature, which we'll talk about more in just a moment, is typically pseudo-anonymous, although they like to claim that very ancient people wrote them. So Enoch wrote this, or Abraham wrote this, or Shem, right, wrote this. So they like to allege ancient authorship. Because, it's just like Menachem, the dude down the street, wrote this. Who cares, right? Like, Manny wrote a book about angels. Yeah, Manny's the guy, the guy that like fixed their shoes. Like, the hell does he know? Right? So, Manny the shoe guy, Manny the cop was like, nah, Enoch wrote this. Right? And so he puts Enoch's name on it, right? Patriarch who never died and was like, Noah's grandfather, whatever. Or father, Noah's father. Like, yeah, Enoch, that dude, yeah, he was real. Let's read his book. Right? So you throw a name like Abraham on there, people are willing to read your book. They're not going to read Manny's book about the end of the world. No one cares about what Manny thinks. So let's talk about this literature, right? Let's get into what makes this work, right? Why would anyone write all this stuff down? Well, the first is historical and psychological. You're living as Judahites in a world of theological and political turmoil, right? Now, I don't know about you. I don't like turmoil. And when my life is in turmoil, one of the things I try to figure out is, why is this happening to me? Right? Because we think, because we're stupid, that if we understand something, we get power over it. You don't. Right? You can be real smart, and they basically just like throw you into a jail or whatever, right? But, and again, if bad things are happening to you, you want to understand why. There's no person I don't think of, right? You can be as existentialist as the day is long, right? And you're still going to want to know what's going on. Why is it happening? Right? Why is this happening? Very few people are going to suffer through immense, like, physical and psychological turmoil and think to themselves, okay, guess that just happened. Right? Most people don't do that. So what do? They try to explain why it's happening. Further, right? Not only do they want to explain why it's happening, they want to feel like it's not for no reason. No one likes the idea that you just went through a traumatic experience and it's meaningless. You're on a rock, free from the sun, in the middle of a void, and in 4 billion years, the sun's going to swallow this planet, and every bad thing that's ever happened to you is not only not going to be a memory, this Earth won't even exist. We don't want to, that doesn't make sense from a human perspective. We want to understand why our traumas are happening. We want our traumas to mean something. And so, what do they mean? Well, the overwhelming data we get from the apocalyptic literature is that God has planned every single thing that's happening in the world. So this is a very deterministic literature, and that your suffering is not random. It's part of a plan. And what's that plan? The end of the world. Right? The world is going in a very specific direction, and God is going to make things right. Punishing the wicked, rewarding the righteous, this is all part of the plan. I think also Nietzsche a lot tonight. What's wrong with me? Right? I think Nietzsche said, right, that the person who has a why can endure any how. Right? The person that has a why can endure any how. People can get through anything as long as they have a reason why it's happening to them. Right? I think I may have the backwards. Right? And so the idea here, right, is that basically what you get is you get a reason why it's happening to you. And what's the reason? It's all part of a plan. And the apocalypticist has been revealed that plan. Lastly, a big part of this entire whole drama is that no one likes being colonized. No one likes being oppressed. No one likes having their country destroyed by foreigners. No one likes foreigners moving into their country and taking all their stuff and enslaving them. No one's really about that. That's bad. And so you want to protest against it, right? You want to protest against it, right? When the French come into Algeria and destroy that country, the Algerians are like, we ain't have it, right? And they protest against it. Now, there are a lot of different ways you can protest. One way of protesting is militarily trying to fight the Romans. You can try that. And people did. And they had very limited success. You can also write books about how they're bad, and God hates them, and God's going to judge them, and God's going to kill them eventually. Now, again, as I said earlier, you can't come out and just write that way, right? Boo the Romans, Tiberius sucks, God will kill him. And the Romans are going to be like, that's interesting, how would you like to be crucified, right? So they're going to do that. They're going to encode it. And if you know, you know, right? I'm a opinion, right? If you know, you know, and anyone who knew how to read this literature could read the code. They're like, yeah, they're Romans. They're going to get their ass whooped by this God and whoop their ass. They're like, yeah. And the Romans are like, what are you reading? No. Right? So that was a way of encoding this. Now, how does all this work? God has to tell you. God has to reveal to you the plan, you, the apocalyptic prophet. And that's what this literature is. It's the plan. It's the way the world is structured. God built the world. God structured the world. History itself is unfolding according to very set rules set down by God, and everything is part of the plan. Everything's part of the plan. And the apocalyptic literature is marked by that reveal, that uncovering. As you might imagine, in a world of turmoil, which I know Jewish people go through turmoil, right? Every once in a while, there's a little turmoil here and there, right? Little turmoil. You can imagine this is an incredibly persuasive form of religiosity. It explained why the world was the way it was, right? It described why bad things were happening. It told you where it all came from. It tells you how it's going to all end. And it tells you that the things that you're going through as a people, as an individual, are not random. And they're not punishment from God. Right? Also, but the Israelite theology, every bad thing happening to you is punishment from Yahweh. Right? No. You're suffering because that's part of the plan in which Yahweh is secretly collaborating and going to look these things through. That idea, I don't know about you, right? It's a deductive idea is imaginable. This on the thing that folks made a dissertation on Marx. It's difficult to read much Marxist propaganda as anything other than repackaged apocalypse, right? It reads very much like an apocalyptic literature, right? Evil emerged with various modes of production, right? It's being driven forward by history, and eventually it's going to come to a cataclysmic battle, and after that everything's weird, right? Dictatorship, proletariat, or whatever. You're like, didn't we heard this already, right? But Marx is like, it's material now, son. It's not God doing it, it's history. So you can see how influential this has been. The apocalyptic form of literature flourished for hundreds of years. One could even argue for 1,000 years, beginning roughly about 350 BCE and extending all the way through the Middle Ages, honestly, right? Because, Jews with the turmoil, it continued. And so the apocalyptic literature kept being produced. Christianity is in many ways an apocalyptic religion. It's a religion that more forcefully accepts the apocalyptic paradigm than any other form of Judaism, with the exceptions of the Essenes. Those folks looking at Qumran that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they believed it so much, by the way, that when the Jews revolted against the Romans, the folks anything other than make Josephus look good, they fought. They thought the world was about to come to its final end. They tried to organize a resistance to the Romans. They were massacred at 2 battles. And guess what? They stored other skulls in the caves near their buildings, and they never came back for them. Why? Because they were dead. Because they thought this was all part of the plan. Lucky for us, scrolls sat there more or less for a couple thousand years, and now we have them. And we can even see in literature where they're planning for this battle, even describing the banners and horns they will be blowing and carrying in the battle. And I bet you, when that legion of Roman soldiers were like, why are they blowing horns and stuff, right? And they're like, that's going to work. And then the Romans massacred them, and they left their scrolls there. Apocalypse doesn't have withdrawal. I mean, like, when you literally believe God is going to intervene on your behalf at the very last moment to save you, if that's your battle plan, stay home, right? If that's your strategy, that was the strategy, it seems. Many of the big books of the Hebrew Bible, like the book of Daniel, is imbued with apocalypticism. The War Scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls is a very apocalyptic text, perhaps the most famous apocalyptic text of all time is the book of Enoch, the book not included in either preserved, thank God, relic of Ethiopia, who have never been colonized, FYI, because they fought like the devil to have it not happen, and they're brilliant tacticians, but they preserve all these writings that are so important in Judaism. And so anytime I think about what the Ethiopian people have done to preserve Jewish writings, I am in. It's not discussing next time. How do you go see what God has to show you, or what angels have to show you? Well, spiritual techniques were developed for this, and a new form of mysticism arose as a subset of apocalypticism in which mystics describe going into God's palaces and being shown this stuff. We'll get to them next week. It's scary. As you might imagine, that's what the angels. Apocalyptic Judaism, right, and rabbinical Judaism, however, never quite saw eye to eye. The rabbis never fully embraced apocalypticism, right? Because the rabbis are all about the day-to-day keeping on of religious survival, not the titanic battle at the end, right? The rabbis are more like, how do we do Judaism now the temple's destroyed? How do we move the temple into our home? And the apocalyptic people out there being like, God's going to judge these people tomorrow, right? So, in many ways, apocalyptic Judaism was never quite meshed with rabbinical Judaism. And again, one famous quote from the Talmud, right? It says that for every time you try to calculate when the Messiah will come, God delays the coming of the Messiah the years that you calculated in the future. The rabbis don't like this, right? When Rabbi Akiva said, right, that Shimon Bar Kokhba is the Messiah and will save us all. The other rabbis made fun of him. They're like, grass on your cheeks before the Messiah comes. Like, that's not going to happen. Unfortunately, grass didn't grow in his cheeks because he did get buried because he was burned alive before Bar Kokhba rebelled. So, sometimes history's mean, right? The apocalyptic is very, very dangerous. But it was incredibly popular. On the screen right now is a short list of all of the apocalyptic literature from this time period. If I were to grab my collection of apocalyptic literature off the shelf, it would be longer than the Hebrew Bible. An enormous amount of literature, right, was produced in the apocalyptic genre. Dozens of books that were very popular. For instance, at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are more copies of the Book of Enoch than there are copies of Leviticus. That's Torah, folks. That's like the Torah. The Torah. There are more copies of the Book of Enoch there, right? They're more interested in Enoch. If we can take the amount of scrolls they had, right, as any indication. So the apocalyptic literature was incredibly important. And even with the rise of Christianity, it didn't stop being produced. We have dozens of Christian apocalyptic texts, right, including the Apocalypse of John and other ones. You might be asking why. Well, Jesus had that pesky habit of not coming back soon enough. And Christians underwent turmoil too. They were being persecuted by the Roman Empire. They were being marginalized by the Jewish people that didn't really like them. They thought they were weird. They faced their own turmoil. Jesus wasn't coming back, and people started dying. Well, what do we do with people dying and Jesus not back? Year after year after year. Well, you invent further and further apocalyptic ideas about what's going on. And the persecutions are all part of the plan, right? Martyrdom becomes the thing you should rush into because it's part of God's plan, right? Part of God's plan. Of course, also in the Islamic literature, apocalypticism will also become enormously influential, and many apocalyptic Christian and Jewish ideas also make their appearance in the Quran. The Dajjal is a good example of a sort of antichrist character, the Battle of Gog and Magog, the main battle at the end of the world, which occurs in the book of Daniel and is translated into the book of the Battle of Megiddo in Christian literature. Even the return of Jesus and the resurrection of the dead, these are all apocalyptic ideas that also occur in Islam. So Islam is also deeply influenced, and in some sense, an apocalyptic religion in itself. Judaism is going to increasingly abandon apocalypticism. And the answer for that is the same answer why the book of Maccabees is not included in the Bible. The rabbis, right? And also, by the way, why the Hanukkah festival is not about the Maccabees, it's about a miracle. The reason why? Disastrous rebellion after disastrous rebellion. The rabbis didn't want any more Rambos. They were tired of that machismo, we're going to fight the Roman stuff, because it just got us killed. So they said, we're not doing that anymore, and we're not going to prioritize that. And so, as you can imagine, this apocalyptic literature really gears people to do rather extreme things, right? Because again, they all think it's part of the plan, and God's going to intervene in history and do whatever. And it doesn't happen. Over and over and over again, it doesn't come to pass. But the rabbis don't like this, they think it's dangerous, and they marginalize it. And eventually, rabbinical Judaism, right, moves past apocalyptic literature. And very little of it gets produced. Well, not so much. Very little gets produced in the aftermath of the 135 rebellion by Bar Kokhba, but there is some, right? There are some texts that do get produced, like the Apocalypse of the 10 Signs, and Forgive Mashiach, and things like this. So the literature does survive a little bit longer. Just to say, just to wrap up for tonight, folks, needless to say, apocalypticism as a mode of religiosity, I would argue is the most enduring mode of religiosity in the world today. So enduring that apocalyptic ideas have entered even into things like Buddhism, right? Apocalyptic ideas flowing from this tradition have even entered into things like Buddhism. Om Shinrikyo is a good example of an apocalyptic quasi-Buddhist sect. You may remember them for having poisoned the subway system in Japan with sarin gas in the 1990s as part of an apocalyptic agenda. To this day, in a 2012 poll, nearly 15% of people worldwide believe the world will end in their lifetime. That's millions of people, folks. That's hundreds of millions of people that believe the world's going to end in their lifetime. That's an apocalyptic idea, right? And apocalyptic sects are a huge part of American religiosity. One can think of Branch Davidians out there in Waco, Texas, and other kinds of things. And again, of course, those folks, part of the reason what motivated them to stay in that building was an apocalyptic understanding of history. And of course, that probably led to them being massacred by the U.S. government. They had their own hand to play in it too, but I do think that was pretty significant mismanagement. Anyway. Well, Rabbinical Judaism and Kabbalah are going to win the day over and against apocalypticism. Apocalypticism was enormously important over the course of about 500 years in Judaism specifically, and it has made an enormous impact on world religiosity. I might even argue, like I said earlier, that apocalypticism as a mode of religiosity is perhaps the dominant religious mode in the world today. Right? I would be willing to make that argument, I think. But what's going to emerge in terms of mysticism for the purposes of our learning together is that a form of practical apocalypticism, that is to say, a mysticism in which mystics attempt to descend into the throne room of God, is going to emerge out of the apocalyptic literature. And that form of mysticism is going to be what we'll be tackling next week, called Merkava mysticism. Merkava, chariot mysticism. You also may know the word Merkava because the Israelis have named a tank their equivalent of the M1 Abrams after the chariot of God, which seems appropriate for a lot of reasons. But at any rate, what I want to put on the screen right now are just some recommended readings. If you want to grab these ISBNs, and I also want to share these slides with everybody for the class so you can have access to the slides later. But if you want a great apocalyptic literature reader, just a collection of apocalyptic literature, this is a really great text by Reddish. The large scholar of apocalypticism in the world now is John J. Collins. His book, Apocalyptic Imagination, is the definitive study of apocalypse. It's the book. Right, if you take a college level class on apocalypticism, you'll be reading Collins' book. If you're interested in Christian apocalypticism, Bernard McGinn, the leading scholar in Christian mysticism, has written a really great book about apocalyptic traditions in the Middle Ages. People like Walter Fior, done in the most amazing way possible. And of course, also John Reeves has published another text on trajectories in Near Eastern apocalypticism, and this actually covers Jewish apocalypticism through the Middle Ages, which doesn't get much play, mostly because a lot of it's not translated, but Reeves provides a great introduction to that literature, which is also forms of apocalypticism that survive into Jewish apocalypticism that survives into the Middle Ages. So, again, another form of mysticism that emerges from the breakdown of prophecy, but renovates prophecy to do a phenomenologically different task. To show rather than tell, and show what? The whole plan of the universe and how you, as a Jew, right, or as a non-Jew, maybe as a Roman, how you fit into it, right? And that form of mysticism, I think, is just incredibly important. Christianity, I mean, we all see these Christian folks that are predicting the world or whatever. None of this is imaginable without the apocalyptic turn in Judaism during beginning in the 4th century BC. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic and hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching. esoterica, where we came in history, philosophy, and religion.
Donate to that dude. You're fired. Go fuck yourself.